All right, we continue on with our review of the microalgae, and we've only covered one phylum so far, and that would be Euglenophyta. So let's move on to Chrysophyta. And the chrysophytes are known as the golden algae because they have an accessory pigment called fucoxanthin, which is the same accessory pigment you'll find in the brown algae when we get to the phylum Phaeophyta, which is actually a macroalgae. But chrysophytes, that's the only phylum that we're going to subclassify into two classes, because it turns out there are two major different kinds of chrysophytes. There's a kind of chrysophyte that either does have a cell wall or doesn't. But if they do have a cell wall, it's not made out of silica. Okay? And those are known as class Chrysophyceae. So you'll notice that it's the class name is very similar to the phylum name. So the phylum is Chrysophyta, the class is Chrysophyceae, and they are the golden algae that may or may not have a cell wall, and if they do have a cell wall, it's not made out of silica. Then we have the class Bacillariophyta that have a silica cell wall, and they're known as the diatoms. But chrysophyte chloroplasts are golden due to the accessory pigment fucoxanthin, like I said. Pectin is a carbohydrate found in their cell walls, so if they don't have a silica cell wall, then what is partially making up their cell wall is pectin, and sometimes along with cellulose. So again, their cell wall can be made out of a variety of different compounds if they have one at all. They store energy in the form of oil, and that is to help them float. Oil's lighter than water, and these things want to remain near the surface of the water where sunlight is, so they store their energy as oil in order to be more buoyant. And we have, some people are trying to harvest that oil. They're trying to raise these algae that store their energy as oil and try to extract that oil and use it to make biofuels and things like that. So that's an exciting area of research now for alternative fuels and carbon zero fuels with a zero carbon footprint. Some of these algae are filamentous, like this one. You can see this is a cell. So it's just a filament is a chain of cells. So filamentous, any filamentous organism is going to have chains of cells making up filaments. Some have flagella for locomotion. For example, these guys. And in our lab, Cyanura would be the golden algae that has flagella and is swimming around. Then we have the class Bacillariophyceae, as I said, and these are also known as the diatoms because they're the ones that have silica cell walls, and you can see that their cell walls are very intricate. And we've looked at the very first image when we were coming into this part of the unit concerning algae. We were looking at scanning electron micrographs of these guys, and you could see in that one and this one. This is a light microscope, under a light microscope, and you can see that their cell walls are very intricate. They have very intricate patterns and shapes. And they are made up of two halves that fit together like a pillbox, often described as a pillbox. Now, you may not be familiar with what a pillbox is, but because we've cultured cells in this class, you know what a petri dish is. So you'll notice that some of these, especially the round ones, kind of resemble a petri dish where there's a top and a bottom that fit together. And diatoms are extremely abundant and extremely important to global oxygen production and global productivity altogether. When I say productivity, I'm talking about photosynthesis. So greater than 20% of global oxygen is being produced by these guys. I've seen different estimates, but it's at least 20%. And these they reproduce very quickly. Their population can explode very quickly. And a population explosion of algae, by the way, is known as an algal bloom. So they can have an algal bloom very quickly. Every 24 hours, they can reproduce by binary fission. They just split in two. So as you can imagine, they can become billions and billions and trillions of cells in a very short period of time, as long as conditions are right for them to do that. And so these guys live in the ocean, for example. They will live and die and sink to the bottom. And there are very thick deposits of diatoms on the bottom of aquatic ecosystems. And you can dig this up. There are companies that will dig up basically fossilized diatoms, and they call it diatomaceous earth. So you can go to a garden center, for example, and buy a bag of diatomaceous earth, and it's just a bunch of these silica cell walls that are left over from diatoms that lived millions of years ago that have been dug up. And gardeners use it and mix it into their soil to kind of loosen the soil. Next, we have the phylum Dinoflagellata. So these are known collectively as Dinoflagellates. They're also known as Pyrophyta. Pyro refers to fire. And if you look at this image, this is showing an algal bloom of Dinoflagellates, and you can see why they call them Pyrophyta, because they turn the water red like fire. About half of the Dinoflagellates are heterotrophic. So even though we're classifying them with the algae, the microalgae, they can also be heterotrophic, which means feed on others, if you'll recall. Troph means to feed, and hetero means others, feed on others, just like we do. We eat other organisms to get our energy and carbon. So dinoflagellates are called flagellates because they have flagella for locomotion. They swim around, and if you look in the diagrams here, you can see that. This is a scanning electron micrograph of a dinoflagellate, and they have these grooves in their cell wall. And the flagella lies along the groove, or originates from the groove in the cell wall. So they have cell walls, but unlike we saw in the diatoms, their cell walls are made out of cellulose, which is a plant-like characteristic. That's the same thing that plant cell walls are made out of. They reproduce asexually through mitotic binary fission, so just like the dinoflagellates, they can become billions and trillions in a very short period of time. And again, that's what we call an algal bloom. And that's what we're seeing here. They avoid being eaten by producing light. That's known as bioluminescence. So they will glow. And usually when you disturb the water, that's when you'll see them glow. So you may have seen that, like if you saw the movie The Life of Pi. They make a big deal of that in that movie, where he disturbs the water and there's a glow all around his boat. So they bioluminesce kind of to scare away predators. And you can imagine, if you're a fish looking to eat a dinoflagellate, a small fish, when they glow, that would kind of startle you. And so that's the hypothesis as to why they bioluminesce. They also produce toxins, however. So the bioluminescence is kind of a warning, too, kind of like the red coloration and the bioluminescence in combination would be like warning to predators not to eat them because they're toxic. A red tide, is what we're seeing here, is a population explosion or an algal bloom of dinoflagellates. This is a algal bloom from space. So this is a satellite image, and if you'll notice the measurement bar here is 250 kilometers. That's a huge algal bloom of dinoflagellates as seen from a satellite. So their algal blooms can be huge. So that's a red tide. And the problem for us about red tides is it may result in the death of aquatic species, but not only aquatic species, but humans, because humans eat, for example, shellfish. And the shellfish eat a lot of dinoflagellates. They're filter feeding, for example, clams or oysters. Oysters are in the ocean, and they're pumping water through themselves, and they're feeding on many, many, many dinoflagellates. And the more dinoflagellates they eat, the more toxins they build up in their tissues. And then people come along and eat those oysters, and especially if they're allergic to the toxin, it can kill them. That whole process that I just described is known as biomagnification, where the oyster is magnifying the toxin in its tissues by eating more and more and more dinoflagellates. That magnifies the toxin in their tissues, so that when a human eats that oyster, there's a lot of toxin in that oyster. It's been magnified and built up to a high concentration in the oyster. That's known as biomagnification, and it's a big problem for a lot of pollutants too that can build up in the tissues of organisms and get more and more concentrated as it moves up through the food chain or the food web. As we have been for pretty much every group that we study, we're looking at the ecology of the microalgae here, and you're already aware that they are part of the phytoplankton that we find in the photic zone of aquatic ecosystems. And they function there as producers. So they're the producers in aquatic food webs. They're microscopic, of course, floating and drifting unicellular and colonial algae. That's what we're calling here microalgae. So microalgae in general are unicellular and colonial algae that you need a microscope to see, basically. But that's what makes up the phytoplankton, the producers in aquatic food webs. About 50% of global productivity, in other words photosynthesis, is performed by phytoplankton. And a large part of that is our diatoms. And you can, if you look at some of the shapes here they're showing for the phytoplankton, some of them are representing diatoms. So there's a lot of oxygen production going on from the phytoplankton. And you got to remember, in the process of photosynthesis, not only is oxygen a byproduct of photosynthesis, but also a lot of carbon dioxide is being absorbed by photosynthesis and incorporated into the carbohydrates created through the process of photosynthesis in the bodies of the microalgae that are performing that photosynthesis. So it's a big part of the carbon cycle too, is being represented here in the diagram by the CO2 cycle here. They're adapted to a specific range of water temperature and pH, as most aquatic organisms are. Most aquatic organisms have adapted to a relatively narrow range of temperature that they can live in and pH that they can live in. If you'll recall, pH is how acidic or basic a solution is. Climate change is a problem here, and also ocean acidification is a problem here, because if you change the water temperature for the phytoplankton, it may decrease their productivity. And if you decrease their productivity, that not only affects the aquatic food web, but it also decreases the amount of oxygen being produced and increases the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is causing climate change itself. So there's kind of a positive feedback loop that may result from global warming or climate change, because as the water gets warmer, phytoplankton productivity goes down, less carbon dioxide is removed from the atmosphere, leaving more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which increases global warming or climate change even more, and it just keeps going around and around like that. That's a positive feedback loop. What usually happens to that carbon dioxide, or to a lot of that carbon dioxide that's incorporated into the tissues of the organisms, the photosynthetic organisms, is they die and sink to the bottom. So a lot of that carbon ends up on the bottom of the ocean and gets buried and is locked up in the Earth's crust. And that's a natural cycle and a natural way to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So again, these photosynthetic microalgae in the making up the phytoplankton are extremely important to the health of the entire planet. When it comes to climate change, as you probably have heard, climate change is affecting the poles more than along the equator. So here in this map, we're seeing where the oceans are warming up the most. And so the Southern Ocean here is really warming up a lot. And we're looking at the Southern Ocean basically here too, the Southern Pacific anyway. And what this map is showing is areas where we're seeing an increase in temperature above average due to climate change. And what that can create, and the point I'm trying to make here, is that might decrease productivity, because these phytoplankton are adapted to a specific water temperature. So as you increase the water temperature, it may decrease productivity. And that's what this map is actually measuring or showing. The red areas on this map are showing areas of decreased productivity, and they correspond to the areas of greatest temperature increase due to climate change. So that's a potential problem when it comes to climate change. Also, an ecological impact of algae, microalgae. You may recognize this as a red tide, and remember that's an algal bloom, and we're seeing an algal bloom here too. And I'm sure when you travel around, you see ponds and lakes that have this scum over them that represents a population explosion of algae, an algal bloom. So a red tide is just an algal bloom of dinoflagellates. So, but this is an ocean coast showing a red tide. So what's going on in these algal blooms, what's impacting these algal blooms or increasing these algal blooms is the overuse of nitrogenous and phosphorus fertilizers. And when they get into aquatic ecosystems, they cause eutrophication, which is an increase in nutrients in the aquatic ecosystem, which is a natural process. Usually aquatic ecosystems gain more and more nutrients over time, but we're speeding it up by the runoff of nitrogenous fertilizers and also sewage. And what that does is it causes a population explosion of algae, an algal bloom. And the algae live, the algae die, the algae decompose, microbes decompose them, and those microbes use up all the oxygen in the water. So the dissolved oxygen in the water decreases. And, there are animals that live in the water that rely on that oxygen. Fish have gills to extract oxygen from the water, and if the dissolved oxygen decreases, they don't have enough oxygen to breathe, and they suffocate. So we see fish die-offs in aquatic ecosystems, ponds and lakes, as a result of eutrophication. So a lake that is known as oligotrophic. Oligotrophic refers to a lake that is the kind of lake that you would like to go swimming in and like to hang around. It's low in nutrients. The nutrient levels are low, so there's not a population explosion of algae. And you can read the rest of this list for yourself. But oligotrophic lakes are nice, clean, clear, cool, deep, and so forth, have a lot of oxygen, a lot of different fish species. Oligotrophic lakes can become eutrophic lakes, and again, naturally they do become eutrophic lakes over time because lakes tend to increase in their nutrient content over time. But we speed that up, humans, by dumping our sewage into lakes and aquatic ecosystems and fertilizers into aquatic ecosystems, and that increases their nutrients. So they have a high nutrient level, and that's what we call a eutrophic lake. So we go from oligotrophic to eutrophic naturally, but we are speeding that up by dumping our sewage and runoff into those lakes. And that's what's known as cultural eutrophication. So there's natural eutrophication, which you can also call lake succession. So natural, lakes naturally, as they age, they go through a succession, just like succession on land in different ecosystems. But we can speed this up. And because it has to do with human culture, we call it cultural eutrophication. And that's a problem. If you want an example of that close by, Lake Erie is a great example of that. And especially in the western basin of Lake Erie, because it's shallow and kind of cut off from the rest of the lake, there's a lot of eutrophication going on in that western basin. So this basically just explains everything that I just said. So I'm not going to go through it again. But what would be good for you to remember, if you can remember the relationship that's going on here, if you increase the nutrients, and especially nitrogen and phosphorus, in an aquatic ecosystem, that leads to an increase in algae. In other words, an algal bloom, a population explosion of algae. And what that does is lead to a lot of decomposition. And a lot of decomposition of those algae that when they die, they decompose. And if you increase decomposition, that decomposition is being carried out by bacteria primarily. And those bacteria are heterotrophic, and they're carrying out aerobic cellular respiration, which uses oxygen. And all the oxygen is used up in the aquatic ecosystem, and you end up with fish dying because there's not enough dissolved oxygen. That's cultural eutrophication. That's a big problem, and this is the relationship between the nutrients and the depletion of oxygen that we see in that process.